We're continuing on with our discussion of the cerebrum, biggest part of our brain. And remember, in our developmental sort of categories, this is what we call the telencephalon, the very top. I like to keep the T's together, right? Telencephalon, top. So as we've looked at the different lobes, just sort of the physical, identifiable lobes of the brain, now we're going to sort of partition them out into functional areas. And so our primary areas for our senses are the primary visual, auditory, olfactory, and gustatory cortex. Gustatory, remember, is taste. And so, not surprising, our visual area is going to be in the back, the occipital lobe. Auditory and olfaction is going to be housed in temporal, and our sense of taste is going to be deep, kind of underneath this top part of the temporal lobe and sort of behind our frontal. And that's going to be the insular lobe. Insular lobe. And that's where we're going to process information about taste. Now, notice this word primary. When you hear the word primary, what do you almost always think's coming next? Secondary. Why would you call it primary if there wasn't something else? And so the something else is not secondary, but they're called association areas. And these are areas that are next door to your primary cortical areas. So we have primary motor, we have association for speech, association for hearing, for taste, for vision. And these association areas that are next door are going to help process, interpret, but more importantly, all of this information coming in is going to be interpreted, put together, or for our motor responses, they're going to be coordinated going out. And a big part that's going to happen is this whole integration. We have a lot of sensory information coming in. And to make sense of it, it's going to have to be processed and integrated and coordinated so that our brain can interpret it and perceive what's going on. But then we've also got this thing called memories. And that's going to be important as well. How many of you... Now, again, I don't have this experience because I don't have a sense of smell. I've never been able to smell anything. I say I'm nose blind. It's actually called anosmia. But I've always heard that, that fresh cut grass makes me think of summer. Or the other day I was burning some leaves and straw, and my wife said, that smoke, it reminds me of my grandfather's house at Christmas because the fire, always going to the fireplace. So all of those memories that are conjured because of some sense, understand that's all because of the activity in these association areas of the cerebral cortex. Now we're going to start with this frontal association area. Not necessarily the most important, not necessarily the biggest, but with this association area, which is often called the prefrontal cortex. Essentially, all that you are happens in the prefrontal cortex. Because, look, your personality, your conscience, whether you have one or not, I guess that's where it would be, your conscience, your ability to learn, judgment, planning, intuition, abstract ideas, all that is going to happen in this prefrontal cortex. Much of the rest of your brain is going to be taken up with integrating senses, bodily functions, but our consciousness really is going to be housed in this prefrontal area. Again, you damage this area, this is typically when someone turns into a vegetable. Have you heard about that? This patient's just a vegetable. And for a lot of patients in sanitariums, a lot of patients in mental facilities, decades ago, if they were aggressive, if they were non-responsive, what did these doctors typically do to them? frontal lobotomies. They just go in and scramble that part of the brain, and they become very compliant because now there's really no consciousness going on. They're just surviving. That's not really a way to survive. It's not. And I think those are very, very tightly controlled and very restricted these days. But that's the prefrontal area. But again, we're speaking in generality of this prefrontal area and really our hemispheres, because our hemispheres, our two halves of our cerebral cortex, they're not the same. Have you ever heard of someone say, oh, I'm right brain, or oh, I'm left brained? Which is your strength, which is dominant? That's because the functionality of your cerebral cortex is not bilaterally symmetrical. They're not doing all the same thing. And so here, even when you map out this somatosensory cortex, you can see the positioning of that cortex isn't the same on either side of the brain. And so there's what is called a lateralization. And one side of the brain may or may not be more dominant than the other. And so when you look at what are some principal prefrontal and really cerebral cortical areas of the brain that we can sort of map out as right versus left brain. So, if we look on the left hemisphere, verbal memory, speech area, understanding of written and spoken language. And you understand those are distinct, right? There are individuals that if they damage a certain part of the brain, they can understand what you say, but they no longer have the capacity to understand what they're reading, or vice versa. And again, that's because of these areas here near the occipital lobe, sort of in the side of the parietal lobe for language. But then we also have the ability to do mathematics comprehension. That's going to be on the left side of the brain. Right side, this is all shapes, spatial relationships, musical ability, language comprehension. And so because of some of these more functional regions of the cerebral cortex, we've mapped it out such that left hemisphere, science and math. It's all about the numbers, whereas right hemisphere is all about the artistic ability, music. Now, is that to say if you're good at math, you have no art talent whatsoever? No. You're using both sides of your brain. But some people tend to be more dominant. Some people tend to favor or prefer certain areas or skills or talents over others. And so to help us lock this in, I love this picture. You know our first picture we had with all the colorful tracks and everything? I like that one. Isn't that just, I honestly think I'm split brain. There's not an artistic bone in my body, but I love appreciating beautiful things. I almost have perfect pitch listening, even though I can't sing. I can't carry a tune if I had a bucket. I think that's what. But I can hear it and I can appreciate good music. And let me just go ahead and say right now, good music died in the 80s. I'm sorry. I really feel bad for your generation because y'all have horrible music, right? I have XM radio on in my office, 70s on 7. That's my jam. So if you want some good music, 70s on 7, even 80s on 8. 90s, forget about it. Do I know Bo Burnham? The name sounds familiar, but I'm going to have to say no.
He's a comedian that does music and stuff that became skits, and he does a skit from the left and right.
Oh, he does? Bo Burnham, right and left brain. I'm going to have Burnam? Okay, I'm going to have to look him up. Oh, okay, we won't show it in class, but I'll have to go, I'll have to go look that up. I'll start saying, oh, let's just pull it up now. We'll wait. So does this picture help? I mean, I think, and again, I'm a picture person. I look at that and I go, oh, I'm going to remember right brain, artistic, left brain. Don't say boring. I heard some of you thinking that. You got your numbers, you got your science, you got your logic. I like they got the binary code here. Right. I'm like, where they put Avogadro's number? They should have that over there. Right brain, left brain. But both working together to help control the body. So that's that's telencephalon, the top, cerebrum. Now we're going to move down to the next level, the second level, which in many instances di or bi, that means second. And so we're in the diencephalon, which to me the diencephalon really looks like the top of a stool, the seat of a stool. And so the cerebrum is sitting on the top of the stool that is the diencephalon. And it's going to be in the diencephalon where we have our gray and white matter. Of course, white matter. What portion of a neuron is the white? The myelinated what? Axons. And the gray is going to be the cell bodies and the dendrites. The receptive segment versus the conductive segment. And so we're going to have sensory and motor pathways coming through the diencephalon. And again, much like we're going to see with the midbrain and the brain stem, these are areas that are all interconnecting the cerebrum and the cerebellum and the spinal cord. But not just being a tunnel through which these nerves pass, but this is also going to be a place where we can do a lot of processing, a lot of integration, and coordinating. That's a big word to think of when we talk about the diencephalon, midbrain, and the brain stem. Coordination. And so when we look at the diencephalon, generally speaking, and we're going to break it down into 3 different areas, but really the diencephalon has a lot to do with visceral activities, your intestinal organs, your internal organs, and maintaining that proper balance. You heard this the very first day. Now you're seeing where in the central nervous system it's largely controlled, and that is our big word, our theme all year, homeostasis. That's controlled in the diencephalon. But then we're also going to be processing sensory information that's going to help with memory. And it's in these deeper parts of the brain, the more primitive part of the brain, where we're going to have emotional responses to stimuli. All right, so let's break down this red area, the diencephalon, into our 3 regions. Now notice they have labeled these relative to the largest part of the diencephalon. The largest part being the thalamus, right in the middle. And you see how we got the other 2 names? Where's the epithalamus? Epi above, hypo, where's that? Below. And that's how we got those terms. And in these regions, we're going to have these collections of nerve cell bodies. And what do we call collections of nerve cell bodies in the central nervous system? Nuclei. These are control centers, these collections. And we're going to spend some time in the next slide or 2 talking about the role of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. But we're just going to knock epithalamus out. And really the epithalamus is this little grape that you see. This is called the pineal gland. Now, some people will relate the pineal gland to the third eye. Have you ever heard about the third eye? Apparently there's some, and if you've ever seen the movie Bull Durham, Kevin Costner, Bull Durham, have you seen that one? Really? You've not seen it? Come on, help me out here. Okay, they've got this rookie pitcher. He's not pitching very well. And this groupie, Susan Sarandon, she knows a lot about pitching and yoga and everything else. So she tells him the way to be a better pitcher is to breathe through his third eye like the lizards of the Galapagos. Apparently, reptiles have this third eye which is able to detect sunlight on the top of their head, and it helps them manage their circadian rhythms, their day and night cycles. Well, whether you believe the pineal gland evolved from the third eye of the lizards of the Galapagos or not, it does play a role in your circadian rhythms, principally by producing and secreting melatonin. Now, have you ever known anyone that had trouble sleeping, insomnia? They go to the health food store, they go to the pharmacy, and what do they get? Melatonin. It helps them sleep. That's because this part of the diencephalon, the epithalamus, is helping regulate that. But you would agree, sleep-wake cycles, that's a pretty primitive thing. All animals, all organisms are going to have this sleep-wake cycle. So again, we're in this deeper, more primitive part of our central nervous system. Now, let's look at the thalamus, the big blue bilaterally symmetrical structures. The thalamus partly is going to be involved in processing sensory information. Now, you can imagine there is a lot of information coming in every minute of every day about what is going on in the world around you. Now, the only sensory information we're not going to process in the thalamus is olfactory information. But what we're going to see is that the thalamus isn't so much amplifying this information as much as it is filtering out the extraneous information. So, have you in fact been in situations where you've done something repeatedly? Let's say when you're studying. Have you ever been studying and it's just too quiet? And you've got to have some noise, some music, something. Okay, let me ask you this. How many people have to sleep with a fan running? Got to sleep with a fan running. Last class, almost everyone raised their hand. It's that white noise that basically drowns out all the other noise. And so the thalamus, night after night after night, hears this white noise, and it becomes acclimated to it. It remembers it, and when that auditory information hits the thalamus, it just stops. Because it says, you know what? We don't need to worry the cerebrum with that because this is just white noise. Versus, when do you typically wake up at night? When the power goes off and the fan stops. That ever happen? I have a CPAP machine. It's really scary when the power goes off. And you've got this thing strapped to your face and you can't breathe. That's an interesting feeling. So, our thalamus is a filter for extraneous sensory information. And it recognizes the new stuff. And it passes it on to the cerebrum. Now, from a motor functional standpoint, what we see with the thalamus is, again, we have processing of information. This is coming from the cerebrum. It's coming down to the thalamus. And we're going to process it. We're going to begin to coordinate those signals that are going to cause your body to do something active. And then we're going to pass those signals on to the cerebellum and the basal nuclei. Do you remember the basal nuclei? Those deep nuclei in the white matter of the brain, of the cerebrum. So do you see how we're collecting all this information and either deciding what we send up, or we're taking all this information that's coming out and we're coordinating it and making a concerted effort to make sure our body can function properly, especially in regards to movement. Now, the epithalamus, the thalamus, two of our three parts of the diencephalon. The hypothalamus is the third. And even though it's not as large as the thalamus, absolutely we see that the hypothalamus is going to be the master controller of the autonomic nervous system, principally because it is the master producer of endocrine hormones. I know we didn't write that down exactly the same way, but I want you to write that down. The hypothalamus produces most of your endocrine hormones. Now, when you think of the master regulatory endocrine gland, you probably think of the pituitary gland. You'll get that in 239. Is that at the end of 239 or endocrine system? Somewhere in the middle? I think it's at the end. As much as your central nervous system controls your body, your endocrine system does just as much. I mean, you can see it controls heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, respiration, reproduction, everything. And while the pituitary controls the release of the hormones, the hypothalamus makes them, ships them to the pituitary where its release is controlled. So, hypothalamus, super, super important in the regulation of the body. Now, since we're talking about homeostasis, is it any surprise that hypothalamus is going to help regulate body temperature? It's going to help regulate food intake when you're hungry. It's going to help regulate water intake. All of those things are critical. You got to have glucose for energy. So if you're hungry, if you don't have enough glucose, you're running short of ATP, you're going to get hungry. If your blood pressure is low, which means your blood volume is low, you're going to get thirsty, hopefully drink some water. If your body temperature is too high, especially in the summer, what's the hypothalamus going to instruct your skin to start doing? Sweat. So do you see that homeostatic coordination of everything? It's happening in the hypothalamus. Now, once again, deeper parts of the brain relative to emotion, the limbic system is going to be a part of that, but your emotional behavior, controlled by the hormones, hypothalamus, pleasure, aggression, fear, rage, sex drive, all there in the hypothalamus. It's almost like, what does it not do? So Diencephalon is not just this bench top that the cerebrum that does everything is sitting on. It is critical in the homeostasis of your body in coordinating all of these functions, including working with the pineal gland as far as your circadian rhythms. The pineal gland produces melatonin. It secretes melatonin, but it secretes it under the direction of the hypothalamus. That's a lot. So we go through these different sections and you try to think, oh, which is most important? The answer is yes. I mean, which is the most important organ, the brain or the heart? Yes. It's one of my favorite answers to questions. Unless my children ask, and then it's no, right? Parents are like that. We have to be. And then they ask, yeah, why? Because I said so. Just do it. You know, you hate that, but guess what? When you're a parent, that's what you're going to say. No. That's what, no, you're going to say it and you're going to call your dad and apologize. You will. And then you call me next and I can say, I told you. Yeah, no, you will. Nah, you will. All right, so the top part of our neural tube, the prosencephalon, evolved into the top telencephalon, the next step down, the diencephalon, and now we get to the mesencephalon, that mid-segment. That's the very top of what we refer to as the brain stem. So the first part we're going to talk about is going to be the midbrain. But this whole entire thing is involved in, again, gray and white matter. We're going to have this bidirectional information transfer between the spinal cord and the cerebrum cerebellum and basal nuclei. But we're also going to have these reflex centers. These are going to be nuclei that are present in the pons and in the medulla, down as we get into the met and the myelencephalon. This is part of the ramencephalon. These autonomic reflex centers, you think of reflex like the knee jerk, getting hit with something, but when we say reflex centers, they're controlling heart rate and respiratory rate. Those are the two big ones that are going to be controlled in these deeper parts of the brain stem. So first, I want to talk about the midbrain, this area that is just beneath the diencephalon. So here we see we've got sort of faded out cerebrum. We see the larger diencephalon, that's somewhat faded out. And here in red, this is where we have our midbrain sitting right on top of this larger pons region of the brain stem. Now, this is a little bit different look. As we look at our thalamus, this is going to be the ventral part, our front. This is going to be the dorsal part or the back of our brain stem. So what we're going to see first, on the lateral sides of our brain stem, you're going to see these fibers running in a superior-inferior direction. These are going to be relays for both motor and sensory fibers. And so for motor activity, we're coming from these upper regions. We're coming from the cerebrum, basal nuclei, diencephalon, down to the pons. But then we also have sensory information coming up from the spinal cord coming up to the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is going to filter that sensory information. So these are ascending and descending fibers running up and down through what are called our cerebral peduncles. Now, I sort of hate that term cerebral because we're not technically in the cerebrum, right? But these fibers are heading upward toward or coming from the cerebrum, and I guess that's how they ended up with that terminology. Now, on the back side of the brain stem, right here, the midbrain, you've got these two bilaterally symmetrical enlarged bumps. And these are called colliculi, not canaliculi. Don't confuse that with the bone. Colliculi. You've got one on top and one below, so superior and inferior because we're talking about people. These are going to be coordinating centers, almost like reflex centers for sensory information. You've got senses coming in and you're going to have motor output going out. Superior, because it's one of your most important senses, is visual information. So again, we got some country folks in here? Okay, city folks, imagine walking down a dark alley at night. Country folks, we're on a dirt road, okay? But you're walking down a dirt road or you're walking down that alley and you see something in your peripheral vision. Okay, in the city you think it's a bad guy. In the country we think it's Bigfoot, I don't know, big something. And so that visual stimulation then through the superior colliculus causes your head and neck and body to go, what's that? Right? You see the reflex? You know what I'm talking about. If you've done any kind of sporting thing, if you've been in the stands where every time there's a touchdown, the cheerleaders throw the football or the t-shirts and you're talking to someone and you see that out of the periphery, you know, or the guys at the baseball game where they just grab the ball and keep it from killing the kid or somebody. That reflex, that's superior colliculus. The inferior, again, not that it's not an important sense, but again, walking down that dirt road and you hear something big and hairy, right? Your body's going to go, what the heck is that? Everything's hairy in the country, sorry. It's just everything's hairy. Hairy, hairy, whatever you, yeah, same difference. So the inferior colliculus, that didn't even make sense, and that's the point. Inferior colliculus is auditory reflex, so that your body responds to that auditory information. And a lot of times, I don't know, which do you respond to more? Something loud or something subtle? Does it depend? I mean, loud, you're going to jump and look. But something soft and creepy, you know, like that squeaky door at night when you just got finished watching that scary movie. Yeah. So, superior vision leads to a motor reflex. Inferior auditory leads to a motor reflex. And that's all, again, coordinated through this midbrain and the superior and inferior colliculus.